Welcome, everyone, to our monthly seminar on spirituality and health. And today, I am just so excited to be able to present to you our speaker, Gail Ironson. Gail Ironson is a physician and also a PhD. She is a professor of psychology and psychiatry at the University of Miami and the leading researcher in the fields of positive psychology, spirituality, trauma, stress management, and health. She has almost 300 publications in these areas. She has won multiple senior investigator awards for her work, including from the International Positive Psychology Association, the Society of Behavioral Medicine, and from the Academy of Consult Liaison Psychiatry. She has also held several leadership positions, including president of the American Psychosomatic Society, recently 2021-2022, and president of the Health Division of IPPA 2016 to 2019, and president of the Academy of Behavioral Medicine Research group there a while back. So today she will talk about the longitudinal studies on spirituality and survival. One is the landmark study on spirituality and health, and the other is a 17-year longitudinal study on stress and coping in HIV. As I've said many times to my colleagues, Gail is really the world's expert on spirituality and health in people with HIV. So it's with great pleasure and honor to introduce Gail Ironson. Gail, take it away.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction. And I want to give you a special thank you, Dr. Koenig, for all the work that you've done in the field and for having this seminar series and for having your institute. As you know, I've sent several of my students to you. They've loved it. And you've been a great force in this field. So I greatly appreciate that. Okay, I'm honored to be talking to you today. And I'm going to share my screen and start with my slides here. Hope that everything goes well. Okay, so as Harold said, I'm going to be talking about religiousness, spirituality, and survival in 2 longitudinal studies. Okay, now I have to figure out how to change the slides. They should change very easily, but they're not. There's usually a little thing down here. Here we go. Okay. I don't think I have to tell this group how important spirituality and religion is, but I do like to review some of the statistics. So often people turn to spirituality to cope with crises. In fact, after 9/11, 90% said that they turned to religion or God to cope with the aftermath. Statistics on prayer show that at least 55% of our nation prays at least daily. And when the studies were done on what, quote, alternative medicine techniques have been used, prayer came out as the number one. 43% pray for themselves and about 25% pray for others. The vast majority of adults in the United States believe in God. Interestingly, the latest survey shows that it's 81% in Gallup survey, which is down 6 points from 2017. For the longest time, 50, 60 years, more than 90% of Americans believed in God. And in studies that I've done with people with HIV, far more actually increased in spirituality the year after their diagnosis than decreased. This really surprised me, and I didn't really believe it until another group found the same thing. It turns out that this increase in spirituality, being able to hold on to your spirituality, continue to have faith in God, predicted staying healthier longer over 4 years. And we published that in the Journal of General Internal Medicine. Okay, a little bit of background on my interest in the topic. In the 1990s, in the early 1990s, I was involved in a multi-site study funded by the NIH on treating post-heart attack people who were depressed or socially isolated. and I was in charge of measures at the time. And there was no good measure for spirituality and religion. They were mostly asking questions like, how often do you go to church? This coincided with the mid-1990s, where the number of articles doubled and a huge number of people said they wanted to experience spiritual growth. So a review on spirituality, religiousness, and mortality. These are some meta-analyses. Basically, in initially healthy people, there have been many studies on this. In initially healthy people, there's about a 20% reduction in mortality for people who are spiritual or religious, but most of these studies, about 75%, use religious service attendance or church activity as a predictor. So we really need to, we really needed at that time to expand what we're measuring, which is one of the reasons for the landmark study. So interestingly, in that review, there were only 3 studies, but there were those studies that measured multidimensional aspects of religion and spirituality showed the greatest effect on reducing mortality. Another review that was done in the American Psychologist found a 25% reduction in mortality risk for those who attend church or attend religious service regularly. And they also found that health behaviors accounted for about half of this effect. So in our studies, we try to, we often control for health behaviors. Mike McCullough also did a meta-analysis, found about the same thing. This is about a 29% increase in survival. So about 20 to 30% increase in survival for people who are spiritual or religious. Now, my talk would not be complete. My introduction would not be complete unless I mentioned mental health and the enormous, amazing study that Harold Koenig did. He reviewed over 1,000 studies and found very beneficial effects for mental health for people who are religious and or spiritual, including less worry, less anxiety, less depression, less substance use. All right, so here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to give you the background for 2 longitudinal studies. One is the nationwide landmark study, and the other is an HIV study. And I'm going to show you the findings of these studies. And here are some of the variables that are included, the religion, spirituality variables. Religious identities, which is whether you say you're religious, spiritual, both, or neither. Traditional variables like church attendance and prayer. The use of spirituality, sorry, that should be a slash. It should be a slash. Use of spirituality, religiousness to cope. We all know that religion and spirituality gives us hope and adds meaning to life. I'm going to talk about some beliefs, view of God, whether you view God as merciful and benevolent, or whether you view God as judgmental. I'll talk a little bit about spiritual struggles, mention a few studies that are relevant to the golden rule, compassion for others and acts of kindness. And then our latest analysis that Salman, my graduate student, is leading on is which comes first, health or spiritual religious engagement. Okay, so here are the 2 studies. There's a stress and coping with HIV with a 17-year follow-up, which was funded by 2 NIMH R01s that I was PI on. And the landmark study on spirituality, positive psychology, and health, 3,000 people, 6-year follow-up, funded by the Templeton Foundation. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about the HIV study. And I want to point out why this is such a good population to study. So people with HIV are marginalized and they have severe stressors. So I felt that we could learn from their ability to deal with stress. If this group could deal with stress well, as reflected in both their mental health and physiological markers, then I think we can learn a lot from them. So HIV has clear biological markers of how healthy they are. That is CD4s, which are immune cells, and viral load, which is the how much of the HIV virus is in their system. We know that psychological factors influence viruses from Sheldon Cohen's tightly controlled studies. He's done studies where he systematically either gives you saline drops or drops with viruses, cold viruses in them. And then he determines, he looks at who actually gets the colds. And he's shown that people who have positive affect are less likely to get the colds. People who have good social support are less likely to get the colds. And people have good, let me see, we said affect, social support. People who have high levels of stress are more likely to get colds. Okay, so we can control for initial disease status, and we can also tell if psychological factors are still important after we have good medications. Our stress and coping study, we felt that psychological factors may be most important in the mid-range of illness. So in other words, if you're very healthy, psychological factors may not make as much of an impact, and if you're very sick, they may not. So we chose people in the mid-range of illness defined by CD4 counts. We had a diverse sample of men, women, Blacks, Hispanics, non-Hispanics, and whites. I believe we were the first people to actually have a diverse sample. We did interviews and questionnaires every 6 months for 12 years. It's a 17-year follow-up because we had all the data to follow their mortality. We did blood draws for immune measures. We looked at stress hormones in urine, and we had them do an essay at baseline, which we analyzed for its content. We predicted survival for 17 years. Okay, here are some of the spirituality variables. We developed a measure to measure both religion and spirituality. It has 4 subscales: the sense of peace, faith, religious behavior, and compassion for others. We have data on prayer that we published on. We developed a scale for view of God. We did studies on compassion for self and others. So you'll hear about each of these in the rest of the talk. We looked at what people do to use spirituality to cope. And we looked at meaning, which was rated both by the interviewer when they did the interview, and by the transcript of the interview by 2 raters. And I always like to show the picture of my students and staff because it takes a village to do these kinds of studies. And you can see we had a diverse staff. I just want to point out a couple of things here. This little child, he grew up in our office, and he's now 26 and married. This is me. I look like a student. I'm 50 in this picture. This is Heidi Marie Kramer. If you look at my articles on spirituality and religiousness, she's on almost all of them on HIV. She came from Germany and called me one day and said, "I'd like to work with you." And so we had a 14-year collaboration. This is Connell. He's the director of behavioral medicine at Harvard now. So I was fortunate to have a very distinguished group of students. Okay. Now for the landmark study. So in the landmark study, I include positive psychology in the title because we did ask a lot of positive psychology questions. The focus was actually on, so it's a representative sample of adults. We have 3,000 people. The purpose was to measure spirituality well rather than superficially. So instead of a lot of studies which have added on 1 or 2 questions to a large longitudinal study, this study was specifically for measuring spirituality and aspects of spirituality. It was done by in-person interviews in the respondent's home. We hired a company to do this, NORC, and we did blood spots so that we could get biological measures. And as you can see, we had representation of men, women, whites, Blacks, and Hispanics. There are more women than men, I guess, because women volunteer for these studies a little more than men do. And I'd like to point out that Neil Krauss was the PI on wave 1. It was an enormous, he did an enormous amount. We actually published 52 articles, most of which he did from wave 1. And I'm the PI of wave 2, but he is certainly still very much involved. All right, so here are some of our measures. We measured religious identities. Are you religious, spiritual, both, or neither? We measured church attendance, prayer, some of the traditional variables. We have a variable that is put together by SEM, as I mentioned, with which Salman, you'll see his picture in a little while. is taking the lead on. Although it was proposed in our initial proposal to do this. So service, attendance, prayer, religious or spiritual identity, commitment, and use of religion or spirituality to cope. So we're calling that religious spiritual engagement. We also have spiritual struggles, and we have hope measured by both religion, the religious aspect, and a general measure. And interestingly, in psychology, they call this optimism, and in religion and the Bible, it's called hope. So we have a little interesting, I don't know, grammatical thing here. All right, and then we measured meaning in life by 6 items, like I have a philosophy of life that helps me understand who I am. Okay, and here's some graduate students who have worked on a Templeton grant. Emily Hilton helped me with the proposal. She was of enormous help. Rachel is looking at aspects of religion, spirituality, depression, and anxiety. So these are these students are the last 3 are current students. Yasmin is looking at the positive psych and how it relates to biological markers. And Salman, who is on this call, by the way, I was very fortunate to be able to have him collaborate with me. We've done 2 articles now on prayer and survival, one in HIV and one in the landmark study. And as I said, he's taking the lead on which comes first, spiritual, religiousness, or health, the chicken or egg question. All right, so in all these analyses, the survival analysis, we use Cox regression analysis. Block 1 controls for the biomedical variables. Age is always in there. And then in the HIV study, we have CD4 and viral load, and whether they're on antiretroviral medications. And in the landmark study, we control for age and for symptoms at wave 1. Block 2 are our sociodemographic variables, that is sex, race, and education. Block 3 is social support and depression, our psychosocial variables. And block 4 are health behaviors, alcohol use, exercise, BMI, and smoking. Okay, so here are our results of the survival in the 2 longitudinal studies. All right, so first, this is religious or spiritual identities. And the blue, which is the largest one, are people who say I'm spiritual and religious. So that's more than half of people. Then we have a large red group who say I'm spiritual but not religious. By the way, Gallup says this is the new religion in America, that a lot of people, this is a fast growing group of people who say they're spiritual but not religious. Then there's the green slice of the pie, which are people who identify as religious but not spiritual. And then we have the orange, which is neither spiritual nor religious. Okay, and here are the survival curves for spirituality and mortality by religious and spiritual identity. So the greatest survival is for the group that says I'm spiritual but not religious, followed by I'm spiritual and religious. So they're pretty high up there. And then the religious but not spiritual. And you can see these 3 can be differentiated from the bottom one, which are the people who are neither religious or spiritual. Okay, now on to our next variable, which is church attendance. So this is in the landmark study, and the basically people who go to church, this was dichotomized at the meeting. So people who go to church more often compared to those who go less often or not at all, they're about 20% more likely to survive, which, by the way, goes very nicely in with the reviews that I mentioned before, which is 20 to 30%. So that verified what has been known for a long time. And we published an article from wave 1 looking at church attendance and the biological markers. In particular, I was interested in CRP. It's a marker of inflammation. So it's a predictor of cardiovascular mortality. It's a predictor of lots of other illnesses. And so those who have frequent church attendance were 38% less likely have clinically elevated CRP compared to those who attended rarely or never. So I've got a potential biological mediator here. Okay, now on to prayer. First, I'm going to present the landmark study, and this is restricted to people who had at least one chronic illness. The landmark study, by the way, started in 2014, and we went through 2020, which, by the way, 2020 was a very stressful time because it was when COVID happened, and also when we had the election between Biden and Trump. So I thought we'd actually have an easier time calling everybody because people were home because of COVID, but people were not answering the phone because of the election. Anyway, it didn't affect our mortality analyses because we had the data to look at mortality through the CDC. So it turns out that those who prayed on a daily basis or more were significantly more likely to survive over 6 years. The hazard ratio of 1.5, so they were about 1.5 times more likely to survive over 6 years. And that was after controlling for biomedical all 4 blocks: biomedical variables, sociodemographics, psychosocial variables, and health behaviors. And this is coming out in print next month, but is online now. And I published it open access, so everyone in the audience can get it. So interestingly, this line, which represents praying daily or more, can be easily distinguished from people who pray less often who don't really pray at all, rarely or never. Okay, now prayer in the HIV study. So one of the driving factors for our doing this study was that most studies predicting the effects of prayer on health have examined intercessory prayer, where people are praying for people they don't know. But in reality, most people pray for their own health or for the health of others who they know. And so we distinguish who you're praying for when you pray. So it turns out that people with HIV who prayed for known others were twice as likely to survive over 17 years as compared with those who did not. So praying for others was very beneficial to your own health. Now, by the way, study that needs to be done for any young people in the audience is whether praying for others affects their health more than if they're being prayed for by people who don't know them. But anyway, the reason why people haven't done that is because you can't randomly assign people to either pray or not pray. So the best evidence you can get is like B evidence, not A evidence. But the study still needs to be done. And if I were younger, I'd do it. But, I don't have time for another long longitudinal study. Okay, this was published, Journal of Religion and Health, 2022. Now I want to go on to using spirituality to cope. Why make spirituality to cope? So in the first slide, I showed you that people use spirituality a lot to cope. Theoretically, why would this be particularly effective? And it fits in so nicely with coping theory. So in coping theory, and this is Lazarus and Folkman's coping theory, you look at the stressor and you do primary appraisal, which is how threatening, controllable, and predictable is this stressor? How bad is this stressor? That's primary appraisal. And then you also do secondary appraisal, which is how well can I handle this? And so the nice thing about spirituality is that it can impact on the stressor, the toxicity of the stressor, which is maybe God did this for a reason. And it also impacts on the secondary appraisal, which is, can I handle this? So feeling that you're not alone, that God will help me, will also increase your perceived ability to handle it. So it fits in very nicely into both the transactional model and the meaning-making model. Okay, so I want to give you an illustration of one person in our study. I call her Sarah. That's not her real name. She and her boyfriend had been dating for about 4 months, and they decided to go for HIV tests to make sure they were HIV negative, so they were safe for each other to have sex. Well, it turns out that she was positive, and she was, of course, shocked. After she got over the initial shock, She looked around the community, looked for a support group, couldn't find one for heterosexual people. At that time, the support groups were mainly for gay men, because that was the initial main risk group. And so she decided to establish an organization that would have support groups, not only for gay men, but for heterosexual people, for Black women, and for anybody who had HIV. And she went one step further, realizing that loneliness is one of the big issues that people with HIV had. She actually organized cruises for people with HIV. So she is one of our very long survivors. And she often speaks about how maybe God chose me for this purpose, to make these support groups available to everyone. And so she's a very inspirational person. Okay, so one of the things that we wanted to do was we wanted to provide people with specific aspects of spirituality and religiousness that could really guide people in terms of using their spirituality, rather than just attendance and prayer, which are certainly very valuable, but people often, want more. So we looked at, we did qualitative analysis. Heidi Marie Kramer was very instrumental in doing that, in doing the qualitative analysis. In fact, most of our articles work together. We do 2 articles. She's first on the qualitative ones, and I'm first on where we plug the qualitative ones into looking at quantitative things like survival. So anyway, these were the interviews were transcribed and scored for whatever aspects of spiritual coping they were using, and we were able to find 5 that were reliably assessed and that predicted survival. And here are the 5. So spiritual practices: having a regular spiritual practice, such as prayer, meditation, attending religious services. My favorite one is the second one, which is spiritual reframing. That is believing things happen for divine reason, or that God will help you handle the situation. And we gave the example of Sarah doing that. The third one is overcoming spiritual guilt, which is believing a higher power will forgive you for any wrongdoings. So that was an important one in the HIV population, because we have some gay men who were struggling with being gay, and we also had some poor women who were struggling with having sex for money in order to support their children. So this was a very important one. Spiritual gratitude, appreciation to a higher power for what you have, and spiritual empowerment also came out. The belief that spirituality will help you cope with stressors. So people using these strategies were 2 to 4 times more likely to survive over 17 years than people not using these strategies. And here's a diagram of spiritual reframing and mortality. So it is a huge effect. People who use spiritual reframing were about 4 times more likely to survive. Whoops, here's the spiritual reframing, and this is mortality. So people using spiritual reframing were 1/4 as likely to die. That line. Then here's a line for people who do not use spiritual reframing. Okay, the next variable I was looking at is view of God. And here's Michelangelo's view. What do you see here? A loving God or a judging God? Well, this looks pretty judging to me. And so we have a measure. It's 12 items long, but you can actually do a short version. Having a positive view of God predicted slower disease progression in HIV. In other words, you stayed healthy longer. Conversely, having a negative view of God predicted faster disease progression. And actually, interestingly, the item that predicted mortality the best was God will judge me harshly one day. So this was chosen as an article of the month by Clergy magazine. So I was very encouraged that it was being noticed. And spiritual struggles is a very important construct. And so I want to point out there are many articles on this that Ken Pargaman has worked on, but this one is by our very own Harold Koenig too. Religious struggle predicts mortality among medically ill elderly patients. And that was published in the Archives of Internal Medicine. Congratulations to you to get it in such a highly visible medical journal. That's not an easy task. And here are three of the items that are actually in the abstract. I wonder whether God had abandoned me. I questioned God's love for me. And I decided the devil made this happen. So religious struggles, spiritual struggles is an important variable. So in other words, it's not all on the positive end, although the weight is way more on the positive end. And I don't know what the current stats are, but the stat I have in my mind is about 85% of people are into the religious spiritual engagement, and maybe 10 to 15 have some spiritual struggles. Is that about right? Good. Okay, so another example is Carlos, one of the people in our HIV study. Again, that's not his real name. So he was a gay guy who was taking drugs, and he was really worried about how God would judge him. And he was afraid that God was a punishing God. And a minister said to him one Easter Sunday, "You don't have to believe in a God that doesn't love you." And he said that that was really revolutionary for him. And it enabled him to get off of his drugs and to accept himself and go back to school. And so it was a wonderful transformation for him. So ministers can have that impact, and therapists could potentially have that impact too. All right, our next question, which was our aim 3 in the proposal for the landmark study, was which comes first, religious spiritual engagement or better health? And so here are our variables, religious and spiritual engagement. And this, thank you, Salman, for doing this slide and also for leading the analysis on this. So here are 5 of the variables that went into religious spiritual engagement. It includes religious coping, religious commitment, religious identity, service attendance, and frequency of prayer. And here are the variables for self-rated health. There are 3 variables: rate your health, how's your health compared to others, how's your health compared to 1 year ago, and also the number of chronic illnesses. And so we're looking at whether this arrow, which is does health impact religious spiritual engagement, versus this arrow, does religious spiritual engagement impact self-rated health? And I can tell you that our preliminary analyses suggest that it goes both ways. Not surprising. Okay, and we're also going to repeat this analysis with spiritual struggles. Here are our items for spiritual struggles: felt angry at God, felt as though God had abandoned me, felt as though God had punished me. So stay tuned for the results on that. Our plan is to have these analyses done and the paper out by the end of the semester, end of the fall semester. Okay, I do want to mention a few things about the golden rule. That is, do unto others. And so we use transcribed interviews and essays from the stress and coping study in HIV. And people were scored for whether they were compassionate towards others, whether they had compassion toward themselves, and whether they received compassion from other people. And it turns out that being compassionate toward others predicted better health, better survival, as well as having self-compassion. Receiving compassion did not predict better survival. So it's good to be good. And after controlling for adherence, self-compassion was no longer significant. So the stronger variable is compassion towards others. And I gave the reference at the bottom so you could find it. Now I wanted to mention, this is one of my favorite recent studies, not one that I did, unfortunately, but Steve Cole does work with gene expression. And he has done 2 randomized studies where he compared people who engaged, it was an intervention study, people who engaged in acts of kindness toward others, towards themselves, or a neutral condition. And those who engaged in acts of kindness toward others had more beneficial gene expression, which means the stress indicator genes were dampened. And those are the CTRA genes. Those are the stress indicator genes. And his intervention, people did 3 kind acts per week over 4 weeks. So that's an easy one to implement. All right, I also did some work on volunteering and survival. This is from the landmark study. And actually, interestingly, the best survival was for people who were in the 3rd top quartile on volunteering. The ones who volunteered the most didn't have quite as good survival. And these are the ones who didn't volunteer. So volunteering is good up to a point. You still need to conserve your energy. You know, when you're on an airplane, they tell you, you know, when the oxygen mask drop down, put it on yourself first so that you can be helpful to other people. Okay, now I'm going to spend about 5 minutes, because we only have about 5 minutes, talking about correlates of religion and spirituality. That is possible psychological mediators of the effect of religion and spirituality on survival. So I'm going to mention 3 of them. That is, people who are religious and or spiritual are higher on positive affect. That's one of the most consistent findings for happiness, by the way. They're higher on hope and optimism, and they have more meaning in their life. So I'm just going to show you quickly the results of survival in these positive psych variables. So the landmark study shows that people who have higher positive affect have about twice the survival. That's the red line over the blue line. Okay, people who have positive affect have lower inflammation, which is lower CRP. And optimism in the HIV study also predicted if you were higher on optimism, you stayed healthier longer. And so our next variable after positive affect is optimism. So here's optimism in the landmark study. The interesting thing is that the people who did the best were in the middle on optimism. I refer to those as the realistic optimists rather than the Pollyanna people. Okay, and both groups did better than people who are the lowest on optimism. And I want to mention this because I think it's so interesting. This is Neil and I. Neil led the effort on this, comparing religious hope to your general sense of hope. And it turns out that having religious hope was associated with less increase in chronic conditions over time, but not the general sense of hope. So you have the reference if you want to read more about that. Okay, and the last psychological variable is meaning and purpose. Collective wisdom suggests that it's a powerful force for human flourishing, well-being, and survival. What's the evidence? So this is very interesting. Philip Smith did a series of studies, about 6 studies, showing that people are less likely to die right before the birthday, holidays, special events. And so he interpreted this as there is a will to live. And, you know, but this is like within a week or 2. It's not a long-term thing. There have been meta-analyses, many of them, 62 here and 10 here for purpose in life, showing that you have a reduction in mortality associated with having meaning and purpose. And in HIV, people with meaning and purpose were way higher on survival than those who were who had low meaning and purpose. And that was actually, even meaning and purpose was a more powerful predictor even than positive emotion. And as you know, religion and spirituality does give meaning and purpose to many, many people. And these are the highest ratios of the psychological variables that we've studied. It's up to 3.5 times more likely to survive with meaning. And it turned out in a landmark study also, and the hazard ratio is about 2. So you're about twice as likely to survive if you're in the top third on meaning. And then I have a couple more minutes. So an example of meaning and survival in HIV. So Vanessa, that's not her real name, was a crack addict and a prostitute. She got pregnant and she said to herself, and this was in her essay, God doesn't want me to live like this. So with God in mind, she walked 25 blocks to the treatment center, got herself clean. And at the time of our study, she was giving talks in high schools to people to try to prevent them from getting HIV and to either abstain from having sex or have it safely. All right, so our summary and conclusions. Religion and spirituality are an important part of many people's lives, including our own, of course. Traditional variables such as religious service attendance predict greater survival, which confirms many other studies. Prayer, as it is often used to pray for one's health when ill, predicts greater survival. Other aspects of religion and spirituality, such as religious and spiritual identity, compassion for others, praying for others, also predict survival. Many people use spirituality and religion to cope. We identified several aspects of religion and spirituality that are related to survival, including spiritual practices, spiritual reframing, overcoming guilt, spiritual gratitude, and empowerment that are related to survival. Some of these may be particularly useful when doing therapy. In terms of which comes first, spiritual, religious engagement and health appear to be bidirectional. And psychological variables that are related to religion and spirituality, such as hope, meaning, and positive emotions, also predict greater survival. So in conclusion, I want to thank Dr. Koenig again for all the work he's done in the field and for having this series of lectures and for inviting me to give one. It takes a village. I want to thank my colleague Neil Krauss, the University of Miami, students and staff that make these studies possible, and to the Templeton Foundation and NIH for funding these studies. And to all of you in the audience, enjoy this important field. It certainly adds meaning to my life. And here's how to contact me if you want to contact me, and please put Duke Talk in the subject line so that I can search on it and find you. So thank you very much. And I guess we open it to questions now.
Gail Ironson, thank you for an incredible presentation and amazing, truly amazing work. So now we all have an opportunity to ask Gail questions. So I would suggest that you go down to the bottom of your screen. There's a little happy face that says reactions, and raise your hand and fire away with your question when I give you permission. So it looks like Robin is unmuted. Robin, do you want to ask a question?
Sure, Harold, I'll be happy to. I was trying to actually formulate my thought. First of all, I just really love your study. I think this is cutting edge. I don't want to put you on the spot with something you may not have looked at, but I'm curious as to whether or not you've thought to look at body markers such as telomeres. That's just one that's really intriguing to me, and I'd love to see how it gets wrapped into what you've shared.
Okay, so you are absolutely right. I would have loved to have done telomeres. However, in a landmark study that we did, we could only do blood spots, and you can't do telomeres from blood spots. You need an actual blood draw. But there's lots of evidence that telomeres. So telomeres are, for those of you who might not know, they're at the end of your chromosomes, and the longer your telomeres, the longer you have to live because your cells can divide more. And so it's been related to stress. So there's been telomere shortening due to stress. And yeah, so I would love to see someone do that study to look at telomeres, maybe telomeres and acts of kindness, or where you have a randomized study, or just add a blood draw onto a longitudinal study where there are some spirituality and religiousness measures already in there.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was wanting to see if my thinking was on par. So thank you so much.
Sure.
Next person is Stephen Pan. Stephen, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Dr. Ironson. Thanks so much for the presentation. It's very exciting to see this. I jumped in a little bit late, so I apologize if you've gone over this. But in one of your slides, you showed that volunteering was good up to a point.
Right.
I think it's the folks who are volunteering the most didn't have as good survivals. And that's interesting because I'm doing some longitudinal studies for some college students in China showing kind of the opposite for volunteering. I wasn't sure what to make of that for volunteering depression. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what you think is going on there for the higher volunteering folks.
So I think actually that probably we need to do some qualitative studies to figure out what's going on. And also there may be a cultural difference between China and the United States. So I haven't been able to unravel it and welcome any thoughts about it. And I'd like to see whether it replicates in the United States. So remember, I don't believe anything until it replicates. So I don't know.
Cool. Thank you.
Sure.
Very good. Patty is next. Patty?
Yes. Hi, thank you for this presentation. I was wondering if you could say more about the mechanisms or mediators. You presented some research on positive affect, hope, and meaning, but I'm curious if you looked at this from a longitudinal perspective, seeing if religion can impact these mechanisms, which then in turn will change survival rates or health, and what other ideas might be there for mechanisms.
Sure, and that's an excellent question. So the proof will be if we can do intervention studies to enhance positive affect through a religion and spirituality intervention, or through a secular intervention, or versus a neutral condition. And I know that Salman is doing some interventions. Maybe he could speak to it a little bit, but I don't want to put him on the spot. Anyway, with respect, so those studies need to be done. I mentioned one biological mechanism, which is inflammation, which is CRP, which is related to both church attendance and to positive affect. So that's a possibility. We have other biological markers that we're looking at, but that one I think is the most promising. We also look at health behaviors, and there's a whole literature on meaning in life. Eric Kim has done this work on meaning in life and how it impacts on, in fact, I had it on a slide, then I took it off because I didn't want the talk to get too long. But it impacts on, say, people getting their screening visits, on going to, on following up with doctor's visits. So there are a whole bunch of health behaviors that are related to having meaning in life. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. There are a lot of mechanisms. I mean, the next step is looking at mechanisms, both psychological, biological, and behavioral. We got to cover all fronts.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Next person is Camelia. Camelia, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Such a very interesting and inspiring presentation. I have a couple of questions. So the first is, when you presented the results, one of the first slides, I think it said that people who define themselves as spiritual did better than those who define themselves as spiritual and religious. And then the following slide said that people who went to church more often did better, which to me is almost a bit of a contradiction. At least I misunderstand, like the way I see people who define themselves as spiritual but not religious would be people who have faith, but they don't engage in the rituals of church, going to church and all that. So is that how do you see that? Is that a bit of a contradiction?
Okay, so the first thing I want to say is that even though the greatest survival line was for people who are spiritual but not religious, it was not significantly different from those who are both spiritual and religious. And I think that, yeah, so I think that's an important thing to point out.
Yeah.
The other thing is that when we looked at church attendance, it was looked at independently of anything else. And there is a large literature, as you know, that church attendance is related to better survival. And so part of the question is, and we haven't done a direct comparison of spiritual but not religious and religious but not spiritual. And I think that kind of, it dilutes the importance of these things because people don't do these in isolation. As you saw, the greatest group was both spiritual and religious. And so, but for people who are spiritual but not religious, there are things that they could do, spiritual practices that they can do to help improve their survival. But again, I want to point out that being spiritual but not religious is not significantly different in survival from being both religious and spiritual. So I don't see them as a contradiction.
Okay. And one quick question, if
Sure.
it's okay. Have you ever done like a comparison between prayer, contemplative life, or meditation versus church attendance? Because any of this, yeah.
Okay, so actually that's a very interesting question. And we're actually working on an article on the intersectionality of prayer and attendance. In our article on prayer, we were asked to control for attendance. We did not control for attendance because it's my belief that we wanted a pure prayer paper, and that what happened basically, and we actually told them, we presented all the analyses to them. We said, when you add prayer and attendance in together, neither of them add over and above the other. There's overlap. Why would you expect, and why would you even make it a test that we only believe in attendance if it adds over prayer, or we only believe in prayer if it adds over in attendance? So we're actually, as I said, writing a paper about the intersectionality because it's a question that comes up.
Okay,
Anyway, good question.
okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Very good. Lee Burke, you're next.
Thank you very much, Dr. Koenig. Dr. Irons, Dr. Ironson, thank you for your wonderful presentation. Part of the world, well, somebody has brought up the question about mechanism. Not to be too mechanistic, part of the world that I live in is in the world of psychoneuroimmunology. So I'm interested in mechanism modulation and translation. Are you aware in PNI, it's challenging for us to get up above the limbic system or that area from a peripheral standpoint, looking at the blood modulation parameters. Are you aware of anybody who's looking at or has looked at modulation of that which might be above, such as brain frequency modulation relative to whether it be prayer or the presumption of spirituality versus religiosity, as best one can look at that? Are you aware of anybody looking
Sure.
at the beginning, a thought process, and I'll keep my mouth quiet here for a second. Any thought process has biotranslation. So what is the cost or consequence of that biotranslation from a neuroelectric or neuroscience standpoint?
Okay, so first I want to mention that Andrew Newberg has done a lot of work on neuroimaging, people who meditate, especially long-term meditators. So I would refer you to his excellent work. Second, actually, with a colleague of mine, Dr. McIntosh, Roger McIntosh, and also Salman is involved in this project. We're looking at spirituality and both structural and functional neuroimaging. So we may have some answers for you, but we definitely do recognize the importance of looking at the brain and what's happening in the brain when you either pray or when you're spiritual. So we are looking at that. What else can I say? So PNI, I've actually done a significant amount of work in PNI, looking at things like natural killer cells and well, we have CD4s and viral load. That was one of the impetuses for studying HIV, that we had biological markers that we could follow. We actually found, for example, that long survivors have relatively preserved natural killer cells numbers and function. So so we have done some work on it. Can I tell you anything about results on spirituality? Spirituality, we looked at spirituality and oxytocin. If you're looking for more biological measures, that spirituality was related to higher oxytocin. Anyway, beyond that, I can't elaborate, but I have done work in PNI, and but beyond the oxytocin, we don't have direct work on spirituality and PNI, but I've got a good data set. Salman, if you have extra time. Anyway.
Thank you. Thank you.
John, you're up next.
Okay. Yeah, I've been reading a bit lately about people who would say that they are neither, that they would not characterize themselves as spiritual but not religious, but more positively as either secular or even atheist. There was an article in the New York Times in the last few days about how to be happy as an atheist. And is any thought to breaking out that neither spiritual but not religious, describing those things in a more positive term rather than what they are not?
Sure. Well, actually, one of the things that I say when I show those survival curves for the spiritual but not religious, because when I give this talk, I often give it to academics, and academics are the least spiritual and religious, although clearly this audience is not, is that I say, well, if you're not spiritual and you're not religious, there are still other things that can impact on your health. And I point out the positive emotion, the meaning, because people can get meaning from other sources, the optimism. And so I tell them not to be too discouraged. But we have not, the problem is that is our smallest group, not spiritual and not religious. And so, and we just asked that question. These were not, the landmark study was not in-depth interviews. So we can't really get a good enough handle on that. In the HIV study, it's only 177 people, maybe 5% were not spiritual and not religious. So someone needs to do an in-depth qualitative study to figure out what's going on with those people. And I do recognize that as an important and interesting question.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so who is next? We have 4 minutes left. Is Bill's hand up there? Bill Malarkey? Unmute yourself, Bill.
Gail, you may remember we've probably met at some meetings. I'm a P&I person who kind of jumped in here because I've been interested in Harold's work for many decades. And I, talking about mechanisms, about 10 come to mind. Some stuff we've done, some stuff that our collaborators here at Ohio State have done. We did a mindfulness paper. Within 6 weeks, we were able to decrease CRP. We did a mindfulness study in a magnet and found that connectivity improved within a period of a few weeks by looking at functional MRIs. There's a paper out of NYU, I believe, where they've done MRIs and looked at a longitudinal study over many decades in terms of brain thickness in the depression area, in terms of answering one question: how important is religion and faith in your daily life? And that showed that the thickness of the brain maintained itself for many decades. Steve Cole's data you've mentioned. Steve has done some MRI, some genetic data, and has differentiated between happiness, either pleasure seeking or meaningful pleasure, and was able to show that the inflammatory gene expression was higher in those who were pleasure seeker happy versus those who were meaningful happy. So I could go on, but there is a fair amount of biological data. It seems that the Bible maybe had some good ideas about health.
So this is great, and thank you for telling us, and anything you could put in the chat or anything you could send to Harold that he could send out would be great. Those are very important studies, and I did not specifically talk about mindfulness, although it is important because it is a whole field into itself. So
well, the Bible in the book of Psalms, the book of Psalms talks about meditation and aging right at the beginning.
Great. And by the way, I do remember you.
Okay. Yeah.
After you started talking and when I saw your face, yeah, I remember you. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You've done excellent work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I think Camelia's got her hand up. Camelia?
Sorry, I feel like I'm abusing your time, but I have 100 questions for you. Maybe I'm going to email a few. So I have a couple more. One is, from all your experience, is there anything, I have this idea lately that the view on sufferance and pain might play a big role in the way people make meaning, people of faith versus people of not faith. Is this something that you have come across or you have wondered, like the difference of seeing pain as an injustice or something that you don't deserve, that you have to fight, versus embracing it as something that, it's a challenge that can help you grow? And very much, I think this is something that appears in religious context more than anywhere else. Like, we know the saints that used to pray for suffering. So any of this have you come across in your
Okay, so that is a huge area, very important area. And actually I run the trauma treatment program. So we do address trauma. One of the things, and suffering and pain, people often experience when they have those experiences, they have some benefit finding. It's related to higher oxytocin. That's work that we did. However, I have not directly addressed that. And particularly since there is a lot that people have to go through, that it would be an important question to address. And by the way, I welcome you to continue asking your questions through email, because I think we're kind of running out of time.
I will. Thank you so much.
Lee, you've got the last word. Lee, go
Oh,
ahead.
thank you. I'll be real quick. Just to follow up Dr. Malarkey's comment, the biblical reference, great biblical references, Proverbs 17:22, a merry heart does good like a medicine, but a broken spirit will dry the bone. It appears to be more real than we realized. And we are actually peeking through the keyhole in the door and have been able to see a differentiation in brain frequency modulation that's 0 to 40 hertz in differentiation between positive affect and distress. So it is things are happening at a higher cerebral cortex level. So I'm done.
Terrific. Thank you, Lee. And Gail, thank you so much for a terrific presentation. And thank all of you for participating, for all of your questions that have been just great. So we'll see you next month. God bless and stay safe.